Well, as you can see, the parts of the building have collapsed. The fire has indeed engulfed the vast majority of this compound that has been the
Bonnie,
site.
the entire roof is gone.
The entire roof is gone. Mike, what else can you tell us? Any sign of firefighting equipment? I know.
No, none whatsoever. And there's our shot from, you'll remember, Bonnie, what we referred to as farm cam. That's looking from the north side into the compound. Apparently the north side is not involved yet, but it appears the rest of the compound is filled with that orange fire and acrid black smoke.
Also, within the past 10 days, past week, federal authorities surrounded the compound, very close to the compound, with razor-sharp concertina wire to prevent people from running out. That may, in this case, prove to be hazardous.
Still no sign of anyone coming out, Bonnie.
Mike, at this point, the latest figures we have is that there are 95 people inside, of them 17 below the age of 10, a total of 25 below the age of 18. Now, with us on the phone is a member of the Branch Davidians speaking from prison. Go ahead.
Is this Brad Branch?
Yes.
Mr. Branch, what have you heard about what has happened, and was this something that was predicted by David? Is this a plan?
This is a systematic character assassination by the FBI to eliminate all of the crime scene. Now they're finishing off the job right now. They're destroying the crime scene. America, this is the biggest lie that's ever been put before the American public, ever. Bill Clinton wants to use a scapegoat like the Attorney General. You know, I don't buy it.
Mr. Branch, was there no plan? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Branch, for joining us. Now, as
Bonnie,
you can see,
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the best.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman. Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 039, The Ashes of Waco. Our guest tonight is journalist Dick Revis, who will join us next in the Midnight Hour. And yes, Chuck, just for you, it is now time to clean the castle. We're on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show, so please like, please follow, and please share. Our Twitter is MWN_ST Patrick. We are LinkedIn at ST Patrick. That's S.T. Patrick. Our email is midnightridernews@gmail.com, and the free archives of the show can be found at midnightridernews.com. And hey, we're now on YouTube, so go to YouTube and search for the Midnight Rider News Show, or go to our midnightridernews.com website and click the YouTube link there. It's really easy. And I will tell you that we've had an issue getting some of our opening montages onto YouTube. For some reason, they keep telling us that some of our clips of political speeches are copyrighted, which I know they are not. At the very least, though, we're allowed to use them for commentary. That I know, and I don't know why some of them just aren't going through. So you may see some blank spaces in there at the beginning of shows, but the show will eventually start in the place where the theme would begin. So if you want to make sure that you have the full and complete episode of the show with the opening montage, I would download it from our archives, which are free on midnightridernews.com, just to be safe. I would use YouTube for mobility and ease, say when you're on the go, but I would still use the website for downloading the entire show just to make sure that you do have the entire show. But yes, please subscribe to the channel and help us get the information out there. We'll be right back with journalist Dick Revis.
Hi, this is Donald Jeffries, author of Survival of the Richest, How the Corruption of the Marketplace and the Disparity of Wealth Created the Greatest Conspiracy of All. If you are concerned about how the economic gap between the rich and the middle class continues to widen in ways that are both unfair and criminal, listen to episode 020020 of the Midnight Rider News Show to find out just how the richest survive.
Dick J. Revis is a former staff writer at Texas Monthly. He's written about motorcycle gangs, undocumented immigrants, guerrillas, convicts, coal miners, security guards, and bankers for publications as diverse as Soldier of Fortune and the Wall Street Journal. He was a professor in the English department at North Carolina State University, but is recently retired. However, we're happy to have him here tonight, the author of The Ashes of Waco, an investigation, Dick Revis. How are you tonight, Dick?
Doing fine. A little overcast.
Hey, thank you so much for being on. Now, to this day, I still think The Ashes of Waco is the best and most fair written work on the subject, so it's a real honor to have you here tonight. But I'd like to begin by taking you back to April 19th, 1993. What was your initial reaction to seeing Mount Carmel burn to the ground after having been rammed by a tank?
Well, I'm not sure that I had any emotional reaction. I was, of course, surprised, but it wasn't the sort of thing that enraged me.
If you would, I'd like you to educate us a bit on the Branch Davidians themselves. Who are the Branch Davidians? What are their origins? And how did this specific group organize at Mount Carmel in Waco, Texas?
There were about 120 people, perhaps as many as 130, living at Mount Carmel at that time. The press never pointed this out, or rarely or only skipped over it. But those people were of all races on the face of the earth. About 20% of them were mainly West Indians, but black. And this was never pointed out. In other words, you had an integrated community. There were Asians, there were some Mexican Americans, the rest were white. Almost all of these people, 90+% of them, had been born and raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church somewhere on the globe. You had several nationalities, Brits, Australians, I'm trying to think what else, all the West Indies. They were there because they believed that Koresh was a successor to Ellen White, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in that he was able to decode prophecies, which she hadn't touched. And the other thing was that he took he gave her writings a radical twist, meaning he was a radical Ellen White person. And so this was for hardcore Adventists would have had questions that many of them would have thought that Koresh was answering.
Okay, so how did Waco become the centralized location for this group?
Long story. In 1934, a man named Victor Hodoff in California, Seventh-day Adventist, got crossways with his congregation and his churches higher up because of prophecies he was making. And he decided that the faithful should move to Israel, but he couldn't get organized that big a trip for that far, so he said, well, Texas is halfway. And Hodoff settled and started a community there near Waco, very much like the one Koresh ran. And from everything I've learned, his people were peaceful folks and were much admired in the community. Then Hodoff died, and a guy named Ben Roden took over. And when Ben Roden died, his widow, Lois, took over. And when she died, there was a leadership fight between her son, George, who was not mentally in good shape, and Koresh. It involved ultimately a gunfight. Koresh and his followers were arrested and acquitted, and George Roden wound up, he died in an insane asylum here in Texas. George Roden killed a man, another Davidian, and was ruled mentally incompetent and put away. So David and his followers took over Mount Carmel. This would have been 1987.
Because David Koresh is the central figure of our story tonight, we should focus on him. Who was David Koresh, and how did he become the spiritual figurehead of the Branch Davidians?
David Koresh was originally named Vernon Howell. That's his birth name. His mother was a former prostitute. His father, who did house cleaning in her later years. His father was a carpenter who turned bartender in his later years. No, his stepfather. His birth father ran off when Koresh was still a toddler. And his stepfather was the bartender. And Koresh they didn't know a word for it at a time or didn't recognize the malady, but Koresh was dyslexic. And in school, they classified him, they put him in special education. He said the kids called him Mr. Retardo. And so he had a pretty rough and pretty blue-collar upbringing. He wound up dropping out of high school and becoming a non-union carpenter. And, how do you say, he had picked up religion largely through his grandparents, Seventh-day Adventist. And he was working out of Dallas when he met a girl, and she became pregnant. And Koresh was bothered by this, because he saw it as a violation he saw it as fornication, right? And something prohibited by the Bible. And he felt that it was his duty to marry the pregnant girl. She wouldn't marry. And I don't know if it was that time or the next. They reconciled, and one time she got an abortion, and the second time she bore a child. But they never married. And so Koresh was tormented by this. First, he had a child, and second, he had a woman who he believed he was married to in the eyes of God. And he was quite troubled by that, and just by having had a tough life. And he drifted into Mount Carmel looking for, I suppose you would say, a religious rehabilitation, and began hanging around. And no one paid any particular attention to him, nor saw him as having any special powers. In the mid-'80s, some of the people who lived at Mount Carmel, and these were all followers of Lois Roden at that time, went to Israel. And while Koresh was there, he claims that he was taken up into a Merkaba. A Merkaba is a type of spaceship that exists in the Hebraic tradition. One of the characteristics of the people at Mount Carmel is that they saw themselves both as Jews and Christians, meaning they observed the rituals of both of those faiths. They saw that they said Christianity was a continuation of Judaism. Anyway, he says he was taken up into this Merkaba, and that the knowledge of the Bible was somehow planted in his head. The people who were in Israel with him knew nothing about this, but they noticed a dramatic change in him, which is that he became able to recite or to cite long passages of Scripture without any text around, just completely from memory. And so they came back, and as time passed, they said, this kid has the Bible in his head. Maybe it's true about the Merkaba. And then Lois died, and Koresh became the leader of the people who could accept that story.
What was the ideology of the Branch Davidians?
Well, it's first of all Seventh-day Adventist. If you really want to understand it, you have to read Ellen White. The Adventists believe, for example, that in each generation God sends us a messenger. And Ellen White in hers, David in his. David put a twist on that by saying that in order to be a messenger to Americans in 1993, he had to be plenty sinful. That's why the newspapers call him the sinful Messiah. And he said that's why music would be his means of communicating his message, not the written word. Of course, he was dyslexic, so the written word was kind of beyond him. And these people, along with a lot of evangelical Christians, have had a last days view. They believed that Jesus would return and there would be a judgment of the people here, and then Jesus and his crowd would rule for 1,000 years, and then I don't know what comes next. I don't recall. But they were looking forward to the end of the world, and they thought, or at least David had said, that he thought it would be coming in 1997, and their plans were to be in Israel by then, because that's where the great conflict was going to take place, the great battle between the forces of God and those apostates or non-believers.
Dick, I hear that, and I instantly think that trouble is coming. And I say that not because it should, but because in America right now, and even back in the 90s, we tend to think that, quote, something should be done, quote, about groups, especially religious groups, who believe in a way that is not mainstream American evangelical. However, the Constitution's First Amendment exists to protect the nonconformists and not the conformists. The conformists don't need protecting. Therefore, I ask you this. What was the relationship between the Branch Davidians, David Koresh, and local Waco law enforcement?
Well, first I want to say something about his theology. If you read the Bible, it's full of all sorts of possibilities.
Absolutely.
And Koresh thought it had one message, which led to this end of the world scenario and so on. But he could tie together parts of the Bible in a very persuasive fashion so that if you believed in the Bible, I'd say anyone familiar with the Bible would not think he was insane. And in fact, a couple of theologians, as soon as they heard what Koresh believed, were able to connect him with a half a dozen people who had evolved similar theories all the way back to about 1500. The last of them was a rabbi who lived in Israel who wrote a book in 1940, very similar connection of different parts of the Bible. So that Koresh wasn't crazy, he was systemic. Or if he was crazy, he was at least systemic about it. He could back up anything he said by citing the scripture. Now then, their relationship with the law was pretty simple. If you go back to the trial for which they were accused of, back to the gunfight of 1987, Koresh and them got in the gunfight because they knew George Roden had an Uzi and was trigger happy. And George Roden had dug up a woman buried at Mount Carmel and challenged Koresh. He said, "We'll see who could revive her from the dead." Koresh went to the police and he said, "The man's abusing the corpse." And the sheriff's department, went to the police, they went to the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department said, "Look, we're not going to arrest George Roden for abusing a corpse until you give us proof that he's dug up that lady." So Koresh and his buddies snuck onto the property, carried guns, but not very well armed, and a camera. They wanted to get a picture of that lady in the casket. And Roden started shooting at him, and that was the gunfight. The only person wounded was Roden took a bullet in the thumb. But they were acquitted. After that, at the time, Mount Carmel was under the control of Roden. When Roden was put in jail towards the end of the trial essentially for cursing the judge and threatening him with AIDS, and George Roden was crazy. He started prayers or ended prayers was in the name of George rodent amen.
Oh, no.
I mean, he was out there. And anyway, Koresh and them then took over Mount Carmel. Now, Mount Carmel at that time was a settlement largely of cabins, the type you'd go to on vacation. And they ran off some of the people who lived there because they were hoodlums. And in particular, two of them, ex-convict types. And when they went into the cabin where those guys were living, they found meth-making equipment, methadone-making drug paraphernalia, right? So they took out all the drug stuff, laid it on the hood of a car, and called the county sheriff and turned it in to him. And from that day forward, their relationship with the law was pretty good. They had, in what I guess you would call the 50-acre front yard of Mount Carmel, a big pond. The sheriff and his deputies came fishing out there. That was just something they did. And so that when the sheriff there in Waco found out that the ATF was going to raid Koresh, he said, why? Just go out and talk to him. They had no trouble with law enforcement officials. Oh, I might say another thing about trouble with the law enforcement officials. A guy named Mark Breaux, one of Koresh's followers, left the group and accused Koresh of molesting children, of sleeping with underage girls. And not the sheriff's office, but the DA's office there in Waco investigated that complaint. This would have been very early 90s or late 80s. What they found was that though they suspected Koresh had slept with underage girls, what they found was that the parents wouldn't complain, wouldn't either confirm or complain. And the fact was, Koresh had slept with some underage girls with the permission of their parents. So if he had any trouble with law enforcement, that was it. And the DA's office found that it couldn't make a case. And so he was never accused of that formally.
So how did they draw the attention of the ATF? How did that happen?
This fellow who defected, Mark Breaux, told the authorities that Koresh had lower receiver parts for an M16, parts that would allow him to convert an AR-15 to semi-automatic fire. And that was of some interest. But then a UPS driver made a delivery to Mount Carmel, took a box out of his truck, it fell, or he dropped it, it broke open, and he saw dummy grenades inside. And so he called the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office referred it to the ATF. That was what drew the ATF's attention. They then went to their computers and found out that people at the Mount Carmel address had ordered, I believe, 4 kits that would have allowed them, if they'd been good enough machinists and had the equipment, to convert AR-15s to M16s to semi-automatic fire. So technically, what the raid was looking for is those converted weapons, which have never been seen.
Right, they have never been seen, and I think that's an important point to make. Now, this idea of stockpiling, were they stockpiling, and if so, were they stockpiling weapons legally, or were they stockpiling weapons illegally?
No, they were stockpiling. If we'll talk about stockpiling in a minute, but they were stockpiling legally. They bought their guns from a gun dealer there in Waco, and what they bought were parts for AR-15s, which they then put together to make weapons they could sell. It, as I said, turned out to be cheaper than buying one where the manufacturer had put it together. And they were going to gun shows and selling AR-15s and also hunting vests with dummy grenades affixed to them. And they had a gun show business. Koresh's argument was that, first of all, they can make a little money by assembling them themselves, and secondly, he said that AR-15s will be prohibited, and when that happens, the price will go up. He was a prophet. That turned out to be true.
When and why did the ATF first surround Mount Carmel?
Well, the ATF began its investigation the spring before its raid in 1993. It visited Koresh's gun dealer, looking to see what parts they had ordered. And Koresh's gun dealer called up David while the ATF was in another room there in his office. And David says, well, tell them to come out here. I'll show them what I've got. And the ATF refused to touch the telephone. The guy tried to get them to just go out and see David. And after that, they began flying helicopters and planes over Mount Carmel so that the people inside knew something was going on. Their initial suspicion was that it had to do with immigration, because some of the people who had come to Mount Carmel from the West Indies, and maybe even from Australia for all I know, but at least some of the West Indians didn't have their immigration papers in order. And they suspected that for a while, and then the house at the end of Mount Carmel's long driveway, and I'd say it's at least a quarter mile long, was occupied. Its owner had said he didn't ever plan to rent it, but all of a sudden it was occupied by some young men in their 30s who claimed to be students at a junior college there, a technical college. And they all had new cars, and they looked a bit too old to be students. And the Davidians asked them if they knew X and Y out at the college, and these guys didn't know anything. And these guys, one of them claimed that he had a ranching background, and one of the Davidians says, well, where you come from, I forget where it was, but somewhere out in West Texas. How many acres does it take to support a cow? And the guy didn't know. Couldn't give an accurate answer. David looked up the license plates on their cars and found they were all registered to one address in Houston. That's when they knew that it was the ATF or the FBI. And then the people at that house, called the undercover house, began to try to make friends with the Davidians, and they were out on a gun range one day, which they had one at Mount Carmel, and started passing around, let me shoot your gun, you can shoot mine. And one of the agents gave David his gun, and David noticed that it was a modified weapon. All sorts of technical talk he told the ATF. And he said, this is the kind of gun a sniper has. Then they knew they were probably dealing with the ATF. And so the ATF was slowly trying to build a case against Koresh. They sent in an undercover guy, and they all know who he was. They all knew. And some of the Davidians says, let's keep him out. And David said, oh no, let's take him in. And there's the case of a character in the Bible, I forget who it is now, Saul or Paul, something like that, I think, who was a government official. And the early Christians converted him. And that's who David thought that guy was. This is the fellow we're going to convert. They even prepared the men lived in usually two of them in one room. They prepared a place for this guy to go. And so they were looking for him to convert. And they were pretty sure they knew who he was.
At what point was the ATF trying to drive them out of Mount Carmel?
I don't think they ever tried to drive them out of the home before the raid, because, they could have, for example, they could have arrested Koresh any time he drove into Waco, because he had to pass their house to do that. And they wouldn't do it because they were afraid that at least this is what they say, that the evidence they were looking for would be destroyed if they arrested Koresh. Well, for the same reason, they wouldn't try to drive the Davidians out, because they would take the evidence, the converted weapons, with them.
Let's move to the first firing of shots. Now, this is, 8 to 10 weeks ahead of April?
This is February 28th of 93.
Who fired the first shots and why? What happened?
Well, one of the characteristics of what happened, it's kind of like the JFK assassination, is that every claim is contested and we don't know most things for certain. What we know is that at this junior college, the ATF assembled a force, both air and land. They had 2 or 3 helicopters, which they sent up in the air, and they had 3 or 4 cattle trailers, which they sent in on the ground. And the plan was they were going to catch the males, who would have been the armed people, going to catch them outside where they were working on an expansion of Mount Carmel, doing cement work at that point. And they were going to separate the males and females. They had female agents to deal with the women and children in Mount Carmel. And they were going to bust in and find the 4 converted weapons and arrest Koresh. The plan didn't go as they thought. The undercover agent, well, first of all, there was a Davidian who was a rural mail carrier, and he was driving along a rural road when he saw a TV vehicle on the side of the road, like maybe the driver was lost. So he stopped and asked the driver if he needed help. And the driver said something to the effect of, "Something big's going to happen today. Do you know where Mount Carmel is?" Words to that effect. So the Davidian told him where it was, and then then drove straight to Mount Carmel and said something's fixing to happen. They had also been forewarned because the day before a series in the Waco newspaper came out called The Sinful Messiah, which made the usual allegations against Koresh. So that they knew that, something was about to happen, and then David Jones, the Davidian, ran into that TV guy. So he comes in and he says something's fixing to happen, and the undercover cop is there at Mount Carmel and hears the report that something's fixing to happen. So he makes an excuse to go back to the undercover house. And he tells David he's got to go back, and David says, "Yes, we know. You have to do what you have to do." And so they knew it was coming. The undercover guy runs across to the undercover house, tells his superiors to call off the raid. They've lost the element of surprise. ATF superiors decide to go ahead anyway. So here come the cattle trailers full of ATF agents. They park in front of Mount Carmel and jump out. And their plan was they had designated roads. There were a bunch of dogs and behind a fence between the building and the parking lot. Behind a fence, they thought they might have to kill them. The dogs came and barked. They did bark. And they did kill them. The ATFers did kill the dogs. That's one argument, that the first shots were at the dogs. Now, the problem is, at that time there were helicopters overhead. And the Davidians say that the first shots came from the air and downwards into their water tank. They killed 1 or 2 of them, left bullet holes in the roof, which, you can see that they said you could see from the trajectory of the bullet from what it did to the sheetrock. But in any case, another argument is that the helicopters fired first. The ATFers on the helicopters were filmed with their own AR-15s, and so they could have done that firing. They say they didn't. And very disingenuously, their first defense was the helicopters were not armed. Well, it's true, the helicopters didn't have guns on them, but the men on them had guns. And one of the arguments brought out at trial by the ATF is that, well, if anybody fired from the helicopters, it was in self-defense. And there was testimony that one Davidian in particular had fired at the helicopters. So the second theory is the first shots came from the air, and it's broken into two parts. The ATFers fired first, or the Davidians did. I would also point out that there was a man, Peter Gent was his name, an Australian, who was working in a water tower behind Mount Carmel. And he poked his head up to see what was going on, and somebody shot him. And that was probably a shot from a helicopter, though we can't be sure. 2 or 3 of the ATFers who were on the front of the building claim credit for it. But anyway, we don't know if the first shots were fired at dogs or at people, or if the first shots were fired from the air. Now, as for if the first shots weren't fired at dogs, or if you want to know who fired the first shots at human beings, the Davidians say that the first shots came through what, standing outside the building, would have been the left-hand front door. They had one of these double-door arrangements. And that the ATF fired through that door. This is controversial because it's illegal for a federal agent to fire at an unseen target. You can't see the target who would be behind that door. That's also the problem with the bullet holes going through the roofs. And so the Davidians say the ATF fired in there first. And the ATF says the Davidians fired from inside the house out the left door first. The Davidians say, no, the ATF fired at us. Oh, excuse me. ATF says the Davidians opened that left front door and fired out it. The Davidians say, no, the ATF fired into those doors from outside. And there's no... those doors would also show the trajectories of the bullets, which side the bullets were fired through. But those doors, which if you watch footage of the fire, those doors fell forward into the dirt during the fire and are present in film taking after the building is gone on that same morning, laying there on the ground. Then they disappear. They've never been found.
We all know that when the media takes over a story, the story changes. And after the conflict in February, the conflict you just described, the national media takes a hold of the story and starts using what I call loaded language. They start to call Mount Carmel a compound, even though it was a home. It was a home, it was not a compound. They started to call the Branch Davidians a cult, and they started using the typical cult leader archetype in describing David Koresh. Now, I'd like your views on how this story was portrayed in the media in the spring of '93, and how you think it changed what eventually happened.
Well, the way it changed the story that eventually happened is that it created what I call an electronic lynching, meaning in 1924, for example, in Waco, a black man was accused of some heinous crime. He was being held in the jail there at the courthouse. A crowd gathered. People harangued the crowd about the black prisoner, whipped up a lynch mood. They went in, took him out of jail, and lynched him. The media during the Branch Davidian conflict did the same thing, only it was done by television. Right. They whipped people up into a lynch mood so that when April 19th came, most people said, go in and get them. Even in the newspapers, the language, as you point out, was biased. To call somebody a cult member is to say your denomination is smaller than mine. And I noted that Jesus had 12 followers. David had at least 120. So, and then the media was handicapped, even those reporters who were thinking about the subject, because you could only get one side of the story. The Davidians who came out were kept incommunicado by the authorities. They were jailed and were not allowed to talk to the press. The Dallas Morning News filed a lawsuit saying we should be allowed to interview those prisoners. But of course, lawsuits take a long time, right? The place burned down before there could be a ruling. But the only people you could hear from were the ATF and FBI spokesmen, and they gave daily press conferences, which, at least in Texas, were televised live. So every day you had a press conference with the FBI and the ATF giving its version of the story and calling Koresh and his followers names and saying that his followers were hostages and all sorts of stuff that just turned out not to be true. And the reporters had no choice but to be stenographers, meaning they had no way to question what the facts were. When Koresh and them were reported to have a rifle with a range of almost 2 miles, and so the authorities sealed off the area around Mount Carmel, and you couldn't get closer to it than 2 miles. The footage you've seen all comes from telephoto lenses that are about 3 feet long.
You know, I'm glad you used the word hostages, because part of the subconscious reaction one is supposed to have when hearing the word cult is that of an environment wherein an exit is not allowed by the cult leader. But Koresh wasn't a cult leader, and this was not a cult. The Branch Davidians could come and go as they please. You mentioned the mail carrier earlier, for example. And regarding the child molestation charges, there are religions in America, and many more around the world even today, that view marrying ages differently than American law. And Koresh absolutely saw these as marriages, did he not?
Well, all Christians believe that all Christians are the brides of Christ. And David says, "You are all my brides, men and women." But he separated them by sex. They had separate floors in the building, and he was the only one who could sleep with any of the females. And as for the child molestation, there is in the book of Revelation, which is behind a lot of Koresh's theology, during the end times, there are 24 judges who stand in judgment over people, and they are all born to virgins. Koresh thought that he had to produce, he said, we don't know what he thought, he said he had to father those 24 judges. And so the parents who followed him believed that it was a great honor for their daughters to be picked. What I found out most interesting about Mount Carmel was not the fireworks, but what it reveals about American society. And we say we have freedom of religion, but we prohibit sex with women under 16 or 18, depending on what state you're in, maybe 14 somewhere. So that you can believe what you want, but anything you practice is regulated if the government wants to regulate it. And so I began to think about that. The same thing is true about guns. We claim that you have a right to bear firearms, but everybody knows that's regulated. And so what happened exposes our mythology, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of gun ownership. It exposes our mythology and teaches us a lot about where we're still living today.
Well, you're exactly right, and that's really the crux of inalienable rights. They are rights that cannot be given away, nor can they be voluntarily or involuntarily given away. If it can be taken away or given away, then it is no longer an inalienable right. And for many out there who may still use the word cult to describe the Branch Davidians, I want to get this on record. They were allowed to leave at any time. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, some were encouraged to leave because the people at Mount Carmel thought they were on Noah's Arks, what it amounts to, that there was going to be this great conflict and God's people would survive. And so there were some people who Koresh thought were theologically weak, right? And he wanted them to leave so as to assure the victory. It was almost as if you don't deserve to be here, was the attitude he took to some of them. So all of them were free to leave, and some of them were encouraged to leave.
And thus we can officially uncheck that box on the How to Be a Cult checklist, finally. And at this time, the power no longer really resided with the local or state ATF either. The Clinton White House, as well as the Clinton Justice Department, were actively becoming more involved. Who was calling the shots from Washington, D.C.? What was the chain of command? Now, I've heard many names bandied around as having different roles in this. I've heard Janet Reno, Hillary Clinton, Webb Hubbell, Vince Foster, and of course, President Clinton. So who was really involved?
Well, at the time I wrote my book, the FBI and the ATF were not saying anything except in print, where they weren't saying anything either. And so I'm not familiar with that as I am the rest of the scenario. But we know that Bill Clinton was consulted on this 3 or 4 times, and his instructions, except for the last time, were take it easy, let's negotiate our way out of this. But you had in the FBI's plan both a negotiation team and an action team. And they didn't get along, and they worked at cross purposes. And so ultimately this conflict came down to, do we make the raid on April the 19th? And Clinton told Janet Reno it was her call.
And exactly when did Attorney General Janet Reno make that call? Was it on the 19th or was it before?
I think she made it on the 17th. But the dynamics that I know of there is that she didn't read the fine print. The FBI brought her an action plan, and it said that they were to distribute tear gas, or CS gas, which is quite a bit different, CS gas into Mount Carmel over a period of 48 hours. But, it said, if they encountered resistance, then they could go full force immediately. Well, of course, when they started banging Mount Carmel with those tanks, there was resistance. People shot at the tanks. Not that you can hurt a tank with an AR-15, but they tried. And when they shot at the tanks, the FBI says, let's go. And in less than 4 hours, they used all that gas. By the way, that is CS gas, which is forbidden for use in international warfare. The Geneva Accords forbids its use. It can be used domestically, but not in warfare between two nations, because it's nasty stuff. You almost have to be exposed to it to know how bad it is, but to call it tear gas is to use a euphemism. There is such a thing as, there are milder forms of tear gas, but CS is what's the word? That's 100 proof.
And really confirming to me that the American military-industrial complex is much more concerned with Americans than they are with international targets. But let's move to April 19th, 93. Now, give us the details of that day. What happened? How did we end up with a tank going through the front door and a fire that killed everyone inside?
The FBI had 2 types of tank. One type had a boom on the front of it where you could mount a CS gas canister and then pull a rope or a chain and fire that CS gas into the building. The other tanks were making holes so that the CS gas could be inserted by those who had the booms. And so they were banging around the building and shooting all that gas in. Now, there's a problem there that I think has never been resolved. The CS canister uses a grenade launcher of the same size amenable to use by the same grenade launcher or incendiary rounds. Each tank driver, and it was FBI guys driving the tanks, was given 2 boxes of canisters, 1 incendiary, 1 CS gas. They put them at their feet on the floor of the tank. They originally said they fired none of the incendiary rounds. A few years later, they admitted they had fired 1 incendiary round. The problem I see is that if you're in that tank and you're reaching down at your feet to pick up a canister to put in your grenade launcher, some of the canisters were also fired by grenade launchers, some by boom. If you're reaching down to pick up a canister, put in that grenade launcher, what if you pick up an incendiary canister by accident? You could start the building on fire. Well, the military, Fort Hood, which it's a tank base, has a method for knowing what happens and controlling it. When they give you the canisters, they count them out. You've got so many of this type and so many of that type. When you bring the tank back from whatever maneuver you're on, they count how many are left. So they know how many canisters and of what kind you were firing. Neither the count in nor the count out was done on April the 19th. So we cannot know that none of those guys accidentally or on purpose fired an incendiary round. Some of them may have, accidentally or on purpose. In any case, they were knocking holes in the building and shooting tear gas in, both from booms and from grenade launchers. That gas, as a warning on the canister, it says not for use indoors, danger of explosion. For all we know, Mount Carmel did not have electricity. They were using Coleman lanterns. For all we know, that started the fire, meaning some of that gas blew up. We know that when the fire started, that gas, we call it a gas, but what it is a powder inside a propellant. That powder can burn. When it burns, it gives off cyanide. The autopsy reports show 20 or 30 people who died of cyanide gas poisoning during the fire. So it may be that once the fire started, it created more deaths than fire itself would do, than an ordinary brush fire. What else needs to be said about that? The government story is that it says that it had evidence that they were spreading fuel in the gym area, facing outward from what TV viewers saw, in the gym area right before the fire. And if they were pouring fuel, which would have been Coleman lantern fuel, in the building, they say that was the preparation for setting it on fire. It's possible they were, because Koresh believed that the tanks had catalytic converters on the bottom of them. They don't have. But he thought they did. And in an earlier incident, they had been running tanks over close to the house in an area where there was a lot of grass, a lot of wild grass, dried grass. And Koresh got on the phone and he says, "You fools, don't be driving those tanks in that area or you're going to set that grass on fire and it's going to set our building on fire. Furthermore, it's going to burn your tanks up." It may be that they were pouring fuel on the beliefs that the catalytic converters they thought were on the tanks would set the tanks on fire. We don't know. So, once again, we've got various things that could have happened that caused that fire. The big discrepancy I find in, I guess you would call it pop culture, is that people think the fire started upstairs on the second floor in the corner of Mount Carmel, because that's what they saw on television. The people who were inside, and the FLIR tapes, which is, FLIR is a technology that takes pictures of heat. and there was a plane flying overhead taking FLIR footage. The FLIR footage and the people inside say the fire started in the back near the cafeteria and at the end of the gym, not the end where the fuel was poured, but at the other end. So it started on the backside, but television viewers couldn't see that because there was no cameras on the backside of Mount Carmel.
Is it not correct then that at some point, if the Branch Davidians were trying to escape, that they really couldn't escape?
I think that it depends on who you're talking about. As for the women and children who were in what the government called the bunker, one of the things it called the bunker, it called two things the bunkers, a set of storm shelters they were pouring cement for on the outside of the building, and a former cold storage locker inside the building, which had been there since Rodin's time. And in that concrete little structure that had been there since Rodin, had been a print shop when Rodin was there, women and children were huddled. And one of the booms that was inserting the CS hit the roof of that concrete room, and all sorts of people, like 15 people, died from blunt force trauma, is what the autopsies say, because the cement fell on their heads when that boom hit it. And so those people, whether or not they could have gotten out, I guess they could have run through the holes, but maybe they couldn't have gotten out. I don't know. It depends on, at what point they wanted to get out. But I think most of them could have gotten out. And Wayne Martin, the lawyer who lived at Mount Carmel, his last words were said to be this: the building was on fire. He runs into the gym, leans his back up against the wall and sits down. And I think it was Clive Doyle, but one of the Davidians says, "What do we do now?" And Wayne Martin says, "I guess we wait on the Lord." They thought they were in something like Noah's Ark. You don't jump off Noah's Ark. They thought that if they didn't, they thought that the outside world would be destroyed, not the inside of Mount Carmel. But if that was wrong, they also thought that they would go immediately to heaven. And so some of them, one of Sheila Martin's children was sitting up there on a chair the last time anybody talked to her, just waiting for whatever would happen. Other people ran past her on their way out. And so I think there were some who stayed in out of their religious convictions. And in fact, those who did flee, who did go out, then ran into what for them was a great theological problem. The Davidians believe God's behind everything that happens. So God was ultimately responsible for the burning of that building and the death of those people. He wanted to take them to heaven. And I ran out on that chance. That's the way the survivors felt. Does that make sense? If I had really had faith, I would have stayed inside.
Sadly, yes, that does make sense. So that spring, as we said earlier, the story was really controlled by the ATF, the White House, and the national media. But in the years following the fire, authors and researchers such as yourself, people that were really trying to find the truth, have been able to talk to those who had left Mount Carmel before 1993. What have we learned from them?
Well, first of all, we learned that those who kept the faith, which is more than half of them, are troubled because they're still alive. And I asked Livingstone Fagan, one of the West Indians who lost his wife, his mother, and I believe 4 children in the fire, how he felt about it. He says, "My wife and my children and my mother are now in heaven. what's to worry about? Why should I be upset? So we've learned some more about their theology, but it's still essentially the same. And I haven't mentioned the 7 seals, which was key to it. The book of Revelation talks about God sitting on a throne with a book in his hand, and only the Lamb of God can open it, who Koresh was claimed to be the Lamb of God. And the book goes through, it gives pictures of what the 7 seals look like, and you have to know how to interpret them. And only the Lamb of God will be able to interpret them. Isaac Newton wrote a couple of books. I try to read one of them, trying to open those 7 seals himself, the great physicist. So Koresh didn't invent this tale, right? It's preoccupied people for centuries. And we learned at least the meaning that Koresh gave to the first 4 seals. The last 3 only Davidians can learn. They will only be told to believers. But we still can't solve, we can solve all the biblical mysteries pretty simply. Koresh and them thought that the end times would begin in 1997, and they were wrong. We now know that. But we don't know who was responsible for what happened, nor do we really know what happened. And we can't nail it all down.
Though some who left Mount Carmel and Waco earlier have found some peace rather than anger, Waco, for right or wrong, has been used as a sort of rallying cry by the far right in this country. Now, in a way, I can't say they're wrong. This is the result of Washington, D.C., the ATF, the FBI, really gone awry and overstepping their bounds in a dangerous way. The worst fears of the far right were realized at Mount Carmel. It wasn't just paranoia. But what do you think about the way that Waco is used today?
Well, what happened is that the people who saw Mount Carmel, the government's intervention, as a crime, I suppose, is what they would have said it was. I think it was brought about by arrogance, negligence, and guys wanting to leave Waco. But anyway, it was the gun rights people. Randy Weaver had his confrontation with the FBI. A child was killed. And then comes Waco. And they thought the big gun grab was coming. And they rallied to the cause of Waco because they thought the ATF was doing it to as a part of its gun control measures. What you think of that, I suppose, depends on what you think of the gun rights question. But what the Davidians think of it is, why do you bring that up? They think they were attacked for religious reasons. It's all part of a grand scheme, right, of religious conflict. And they do not believe, because they're end-timers, that human beings can do anything to improve our circumstances on earth. Therefore, banning guns or allowing guns is a moot question, because it has to do with life on this earth. They are not political. They're anti-political. We have to prepare for the end. We have to do what God tells us to do so that everything turns out right. Y'all and your politicians, you're all presumptuous. You think you can do something important. The Davidians still hold a yearly observance of the event, and they show up and read the names of the dead and shed a few tears. And a whole bunch of gun rights people show up, and it's really 2 separate groups, meaning the gun rights stuff does not make any sense to the Davidians.
How is this story viewed and portrayed in Waco today?
I have only been to Waco a couple of times in the last few years, so I can't tell you what anybody in Waco would tell me. what I hear in Dallas is it all depends on which side of the gun rights debate you're on. Originally, the gun control people looked upon thought Mount Carmel was a group of right-wing white Christian types, that the sort of types who were churches that are supporting Trump at this point. When the Davidians wasn't supporting anybody politically, right? I mean, David Koresh thought that the government would ban guns and the price would go up, but he never would have argued that the government should not ban guns because that's politics. And so I assume that everywhere, including Waco, it turns largely on the gun rights question, though I have to say the people of Waco were embarrassed during the whole affair, and that made them sympathetic to the government because they got tired of hearing wacko from Waco.
Well, I guess I can understand some of that, to be honest, but what I guess I can't understand completely is how Waco today isn't still a monumental argument about the right to believe and organize. It still seems like the FBI has a keen interest in any group that favors what can be called an offshoot or minority ideology, and then tries to reorganize on the same property. The word cult is reflexively thrown out there, as we discussed earlier, when really this is not a story about guns, as you said. It's about the right to believe and then organize.
Well, the FBI and its surveillance, or how do you say, the FBI's got a bad record on that, right? Any group that is not conforming to what the FBI thinks is proper behavior, it could be subject to surveillance, and for that matter, COINTELPRO shows all sorts of manipulation. But as for the religious question, Janet Reno may have done what she did because when she was a prosecutor, she had a case involving a man who was a santero, a practitioner of Santeria, which is a religion in the Caribbean that mixes essentially voodoo with Catholicism. And it mixes religions that the slaves brought from Africa with Catholicism, and is regarded as legitimate in most of the Caribbean. I mean, Santeria is a big deal. She had a santero who was told by his priest, or the equivalent of a priest, I think they called them Babalua or something like that, to kill a man, to behead a man. And he did. And he pleaded not guilty because he said this was a religious duty of mine. Well, what that means is that you can believe what you want, but you can only practice what the government permits. And I don't see a way around it. I don't think that we can excuse murder, or for that matter, child molestation, on the grounds of religion. But if we don't, we're regulating religion. And how do you say? It tells me more about Americans think that we know how to do everything and we have the perfect constitution and blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't work out that way on either side of the fence. The Davidians can't practice what we call child molestation, and we can't tell them what to believe. And the FBI certainly has, how do you say, the FBI's record is that it's persecuted about every out-group in America at some time or another.
Yes, and you would have thought that the FBI would have learned from Waco. Yet the reorganized LDS Church still draws the ire of the FBI for believing in and practicing polygamy. Has anything been learned?
I don't think that, how do you say, polygamy is illegal in this country. I don't know what I think of that. But the FBI has learned how to handle standoffs. It's never admitted any errors at Mount Carmel. But if you'll look at what it's done since then, it corrected. I'll give you an example. The Montana Freeman had a standoff in, I think, it was either 95 or 97. And I went up there, and so did Jim Pate from Soldier of Fortune, because we were afraid a new Waco would happen. And they wouldn't let the press talk to the freedmen. Both me and Jim sneaked in and tried. The freedmen wouldn't talk to us because the FBI was allowing their family members to visit. At Mount Carmel, the FBI did not allow family members to visit. The freedmen wound up surrendering. Why? Largely because the family members told them, I don't care what you believe, you're my son, and I don't want you dead.
Right, absolutely.
Right. The family members just, played the father, mother, brother, and sister card. And they surrendered that, and they allowed in an attorney named Kirk Lyons, who defends the religious, the militia, the groups that cross militias and religion. They let him in, and he told them, all of this law that you think you know is bunk. And he arranged their surrender. The FBI wouldn't even let Koresh's mother in. So by Montana, they had learned to let family members in. The other thing was that at Waco, they held a press conference every day and stirred up a lynch mood. I think it got out of their control. Things were so bad that the Ku Klux Klan was demonstrating in Waco, saying the FBI should get up some courage and go get those people. And the Ku Klux Klan was against the Davidians because they were living in an integrated setting. But at the Freedmen standoff, the FBI didn't hold press conferences. So, to my knowledge, only one person has been killed in a similar standoff before, including with the LDS, the hardcore LDS people. There's only been one. They learned how to handle a standoff better, and it would be nice if they came along and thanked their critics.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen, to be honest with you, but I can tell you what will happen. There will be people out there tonight that want to find your book and they want to find out more about you. How can they do that?
Well, I guess on Facebook. But the book, you can go to Amazon.com or any of the online booksellers and buy my book. It's still in print. It's become the primer on Waco, meaning people who are interested in the subject read it first, and then some of them go on to other things.
Yes, and it absolutely deserves that. The Ashes of Waco, an Investigation, is a book that I started with, and I would recommend it to anyone. And, the one thing that I really liked about it throughout is that I truly felt, and this is rare these days, I truly felt that it was an unbiased work. I couldn't tell the entire book if you were siding with the FBI or if you were siding with the Branch Davidians. And believe me when I say that's a compliment to you.
Well, I tried to be as neutral as I could be, and I didn't have a lot of trouble, I think, because I don't have any religion. Therefore, if you look at the FBI negotiation tapes, one of the big problems was the FBI people were trying to tell the Davidians what Christianity is. And naturally, they ran into arguments. And my object was only to determine what the Davidians believed. And, not to contrast that with any, I don't hardly have any beliefs, but that wasn't my job, right? It wasn't my job to correct them. It was to find out what they thought. And so I think that's where I gave them a fair shake. I tried to learn their theology, and no one else did that. The whole issue was covered from the secular point of view, meaning people would say, well, why won't those people come out? Well, the answer is theological. It's biblical. It has to do with what the Davidians believed. Whereas you and me who go to shop on Sundays, right, or go to church on Sundays. The Davidians went from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. They had different standards for almost any action in life than secular people would have, or than ordinary Christians who are pretty secular, they go to the mall on Sunday, would have. And so I went into it. I thought that one of the mistakes the government made is it didn't really know who it was dealing with, because it didn't have a clue about the theology of those people. And I spent 6 months, my first 6 months were studying the theology. And one of Livingstone Fagan was in jail then, but I'd call him every Saturday, and he'd give me a Bible lecture and tell me what to read, and I'd read it, and the next week we'd discuss what I'd read, so that I could begin to see why both parties behaved as they did.
And you certainly did that. This is the author of The Ashes of Waco, an investigation. His name is Dick Revis, and we thank you very much for being on tonight, Dick.
Well, thank you for having him.
I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. On episode 019, we talked to Richard Otto, Brian Lloyd, and James Corbett of the Corbett Report about 9/11. If you remember that fateful day and you've always had questions about what happened, join us on episode 19 for more. When you have a great author on the show, it's a real pleasure. In 2017, the first year of the Midnight Rider News Show, we've had the honor of having multiple authors on who wrote the books in their field. It has truly been an amazing year. I'd like to thank everyone who has listened to or downloaded episodes. I'd like to thank all of my friends I've met along the way, and I'd like to thank the guests without whom, well, it would be 90 minutes of me, and believe me when I say, no one wants that. I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year and a wonderful 2018. There will be changes to our show and our site, and I'm really excited about all of them. So stay tuned and be safe out there. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to S.T. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at MidnightRiderNews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.